All right, so we've been talking about the Gilded Age, industrialization. Just yesterday, we talked about Native Americans. We hadn't talked about Native Americans in a while, so we talked about how the U.S. government and incoming settlers in the West have been treating Native Americans and the conflicts that have come from that. So today, I want to talk about specifically the settlers that are moving west and why they're moving west. Now, there are really four job opportunities in the West, four areas that you can find a job in. The first is mining, the second is railroads, the third is ranching, and the fourth is farming. So I'm going to talk about all four of those today. So mining is a relatively newer large industry out west. We know we have mines in the east, and really the only mines we had seen in the West up until this point was going to be gold mines, and we are still going to see plenty of gold mines out west, more than ever actually. Before they were just in California, but now we're actually starting to find some gold in Colorado. They actually found gold at Pikes Peak, which is like the highest point in Colorado, if I remember correctly, and so thousands of people started to move out to Colorado. So we almost see a gold rush to Colorado in a similar way that we saw one in California. But this sort of era of mining is definitely going to be different than, the original gold rush mining that we saw in California. Now we're going to see plenty of mining towns popping up all over the place, and a lot of these towns don't stay populated for very long. These towns would be called boom towns. Basically, as long as there was gold there, people would live there and mine it, and there would be a community. They would build, churches, schools, whatever. But once the gold was gone and they had mined everything that was there, then everyone would leave, and it would be called a ghost town. And there are still ghost towns out west that you can find and do tours of and things like that. And I know some people think ghost towns are called ghost towns because they're haunted. And I mean, maybe that's true, but that's not why they're called ghost towns. They're called ghost towns because all at once everyone just leaves, like disappears and leaves everything there. So it looks like everyone in the town has died because all the buildings are still there. There's still a bar and a school and a church and county clerk's office. There's still all those things, but since there's no job to be done there, everyone leaves and they move somewhere else and they build a new town. Now, a lot of this mining was taking place in, like I said, places like Colorado, Utah, Nevada. Those places aren't as populated yet, and not all of them are actually states. They're all territories and they're all divided up, but they're not technically all states yet. And so we don't really have police in these areas. So crime can be very high. So we see a new type of person emerge out of these mining towns called a vigilante. And these were people like Wyatt Earp. If you've ever heard of Wyatt Earp before, he was a vigilante. And basically they would be hired by federal marshals to almost be like the police and keep the peace in a lot of these areas. If you're looking at the slide, you're probably thinking, like, why is John Wayne on this slide? He was not alive during the Gilded Age, and that is true. But John Wayne, his character in his movies is almost always a vigilante. So if you're looking at a good example of what a vigilante is, that photo is from a movie on your movie sheet called The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, which is my favorite John Wayne movie. And it is about this criminal who's just so awful in this town named Liberty Valance. And it's all about sort of the hunt and the battle between him and John Wayne to sort of take him down. And Jimmy Stewart is in it too, and he's excellent if you like old movies. That one's a great one. But the more common interpretation of a vigilante today is Spider-Man, Batman, superheroes. Those are technically vigilantes. So those are people who are not given, true authority. They're not the police, but they enforce the law anyway. So that's basically what a vigilante is. So by the 1870s, most of the mineral wealth in the country is underground, and it's not just gold. There's lots of other things that we're mining as well. So we're going to see tracks, miles and miles and miles of underground tunnels all the way, all underneath the state's out west, and a lot of that job is more difficult than the mining itself, digging the actual tunnels. So a lot of times those jobs would be given to immigrants, specifically immigrants from Mexico, because it was close to the border, and then Chinese immigrants, because a lot of them are coming in off the West Coast anyway. That's going to be a large percentage of the people who we see doing this, more difficult part of the job. Now, our next, most common job is going to be railroading. So this is not at all a new job in the West, but it's becoming more popular than ever. So as our industry is growing, remember I told you railroads are so important to that because we can transfer products as well as supplies to all these different industries on the East Coast and the West Coast. So this, what's important to make this happen is building a transcontinental railroad, a railroad that goes from East Coast to West Coast. And this is something we've been working on for like the last 40 years. Okay, this is not a new idea that someone was saying we should have a transcontinental railroad. This is something we've been working for a very, very long time. And we basically had two companies who were working to make it happen, the Central Pacific Railroad Company and the Union Pacific Railroad Company. It was almost a race between the two. They had started in two different places. One started in Nebraska and the other started in California, and it was almost like a race to the middle to see who could be there first. They both relied on land grants given to them. So a land grant is basically like free land given to them by the federal government, because the federal government knows we need these railroads, so they are doing everything they can to make it happen. So they would get this free land to build rail track on. And like a lot of these jobs out west, they're primarily done by immigrants, specifically two groups. The Central Pacific Railroad Company primarily recruited and hired Chinese immigrants because they, to be honest, could pay them very little, and they had very little regard for their safety. This was a very dangerous job. The Union Pacific Railroad Company, on the other hand, hired primarily Irish immigrants. And, we've had a long history in the United States of not necessarily seeing the Irish as equal to everyone else. And this is going to be sort of stemming from that as well. We definitely see them as sort of definitely more on the bottom of the rung as far as all immigrants go, because most of them are so poor when they come to the United States. So finally, we see these two tracks come together in Utah in 1869, and they actually put the final spike between the two railroads was a golden spike to sort of like symbolize the fact that it's completely done now. And so now that we've got you can see this map by 1890 we were going to have multiple transcontinental railroads. The one you can see right here in Utah is sort of where they came together originally. But as the years go on, we're going to see multiple lines start to pop up connecting East Coast and West Coast. And this is going to open up for more industrialization and more people to keep moving to the West Coast. Now, ranching is that third job. Cattle ranching is definitely going to fuel this boom out west, and this is sparked by the vast acres of land that we see out west, and it is perfect for herds of cattle. Once the railroad provided the means to move meat in long distances with the refrigerated train cars and everything, everyone is going to get more involved in ranching. So ranching is like a farm, but of cattle, essentially. Ranches don't grow food. They are dealing in livestock primarily. So ranching isn't anything new. This is just becoming so much more popular now. And the system that we used to ranch at this time is called the open range system, which basically means that we let our cattle roam free. And people would be hired to basically keep the cattle in a certain area, essentially. None of the cattle were fenced in, and wherever they graze, and no one was really too been out of shape about property lines. If you ended up with some cows on your land, you ended up with some cows on your land. That was just what happened out west. And eventually that is going to bring in a lot more Mexican immigrants, because they're primarily going to be the ones hired to, keep all of the cattle accounted for. Now, if you sell your cattle and you need them moved from one place to another, which was really common, you had to hire someone to drive the cattle all the way to that area, which does not mean put them on a train and get them there. That means literally walk the cattle. There's no other way to transport, 100 cows from one place to another. You've got to walk them there. And these people were called cowboys. So this was hard, dangerous, low pay, and lonely work to, walk hundreds of cows across, miles and miles and miles of countryside. But it's, for a lot of people, really the only type of job that they can manage to get. And pretty quickly, in American pop culture, we're going to glorify that image of the cowboy. And we're even going to, it's a very diverse group. Like I said, we've got plenty of Mexican immigrants who were cowboys, but there were also plenty of white men who were cowboys. There were African American cowboys. Like, anyone and everyone could be a cowboy. You didn't have to have really a specific type of skill or necessarily had to speak English or anything to be able to do this. So it's going to be a pretty popular choice for people who are trying to move out west and just want to be able to get a job that they know that they will be able to do. Now, finally, that open range system is going to come to an end by really 1890, and that is because of the invention of barbed wire. As more and more people are moving out west, we realize that we cannot really just let our cattle walk wherever because there's more property lines than ever before. And so finally we're going to see the invention of barbed wire, and that's going to allow us to actually build real fences to keep all of our cattle in. And so the number of ranchers needed to work one ranch will go down, but the amount of ranches popping up will increase. So there's still going to be plenty of jobs to go around for all those guys. And the last job out west is obviously farming. This is sort of the most obvious job that we see out west. And it's sort of almost like the original job out west. If you were one of the first real settlers and migrants to travel out west, this is the job that you did. You farmed. Really, in 1862, when Abraham Lincoln passed the Homestead Act, offering up, 160 acres of free land to anyone who was just willing to farm on it. People have been signing up for that, and they've been moving out west, and they've been building lots and lots of farms. After Reconstruction, a lot of African Americans, led by a man named Benjamin Singleton, will come together and decide that they want to leave the South, and they know how to farm. They've been doing it. They're former slaves. So a lot of them are going to sign up for this free land under the, it depended on where they were going. Sometimes African Americans were allowed to, initially right after slavery, they were not allowed to sign up for this free land. And so sometimes they would go out west and work on it, land that was owned by a white person, similar to slavery in the South. But as we get to the end of Reconstruction and there's more opportunity for Black ownership of property, then that's when they can sign up for it themselves. So thousands of African Americans are going to go with Benjamin Singleton out west, and they're going to, sort of establish their own community. They called it almost like the Promised Land, like Moses was like Benjamin Singleton leading all of these African Americans out of, the oppression that they had been experiencing in the South. And so a lot of them moved to places like Kansas and Oklahoma, and they were called exodusters, and they would form all Black towns. And so everyone in the entire town was Black. It would be all African Americans living there and farming and all sorts of stuff like that. Now, things went great for quite a while for them until we get to the late 1880s, early 1890s. There was a series of droughts and a series of blizzards that took place in a lot of the areas where they settled, and it killed a lot of livestock and ruined a lot of harvests and damaged a lot of crops. And so some of them decide to moving back east, but the ones who stay have to basically completely change the way they farm. So we're going to see more of those scientific farming methods and commercial farming methods, whether it involves newer technology and farming equipment or just different strategies and things like that. So we're definitely going to see the way that they farm change. Now, there was lots of rivalries between all these different groups of people. Like farmers didn't always like, homesteaders because they are, especially like exodusters didn't like homesteaders because they felt like homesteaders were just like going out there and just trying their hand at like, farming. Anyone can do it, but that's not necessarily the case. Exodusters really had experience doing this. And there's still going to be plenty of racism and things like that. Native Americans, we've already talked about that being a significant problem, but as we see more Chinese immigrants moving west and more Mexicans moving west, there's going to be plenty of racism against them, and it's going to lead to plenty of violent instances and things like that. Now, by 1890, really, the frontier is closed. And what I mean by that is there's no really more uninhabited piece of wilderness. Like we have national parks where people don't live, but that's about it. Every other, large area of land, basically what that means is that there was no longer a square mile of the United States that did not have at least a few people living there. And not just, any people, but that didn't have at least a few white people living there. So we're going to see the West starting to catch up in terms of population to the east, and the United States is going to start to, more closely resemble what it looks like today in terms of population distribution.